Welcome in, everyone, and thanks for tuning in again. I have a very special guest with me today. He's been covering the Bulls for NBC Sports Chicago for a little over about a year and a half. He was saying about 2 seasons. He's also contributed to the Bulls Talk podcast, and you probably know him for his very analytical tidbits when it comes to Bulls basketball, which I always love as a very analytical person myself. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Rob Schafer of NBC Sports Chicago. Rob, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, Rob, I have to say, and I said this to Casey Johnson as well. Really an honor to be able to talk to you guys, just because I've been following your news and coverage for years now, and I always have all these questions that I want to ask you guys, and now I actually have the opportunity to do so, right? But on the opposite side of the token, you guys are the ones who actually talk and interact with the players. What has been the experience like for you as a reporter? Is it ever intimidating or nerve-wracking at this point, or is it just kind of normal for you? Is it just becoming a part of the job?
Yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it was a bit at the beginning because I came in only a couple months out of college. I'd say what I'm grateful for, and then you're not too far removed from being a fan and kind of revering these guys, looking up to them in that way. I'd say what helped me in that respect was covering college sports when I was at Northwestern, which is where I went to undergrad. The football teams, the basketball teams, the occasional ancillary sport. So that kind of helped just kind of lay the groundwork of what an athlete-reporter relationship is supposed to look like, at least at a lower level. And then I feel like I translated that pretty quickly. At the end of the day, these guys are all humans too.
Right.
And we kind of have it's the ideal relationship to me, at least, has been kind of a good working relationship where you know them. You have a little casual small talk relationship in the locker rooms and things like that. Obviously, we haven't done that for a little while. But as long as there's an underlying level of mutual respect and you're not a jerk and they're not a jerk, I guess,
Sure.
it hasn't been too overwhelming or anything like that. It helps too for me because I'm, one of there's a circle of beat reporters who are kind of around the team every day. It helps to be one of those people that are so embedded, just because then faces get familiar and that aspect of the gig gets a little bit easier. But yeah, that was a little bit of an adjustment at first, and it'll probably be an adjustment again because now we haven't been in person, save for a couple isolated situations. Haven't been in person since March 2020.
Right.
So whatever next season looks like, access-wise, will be different yet again. But yeah, no, that's a good question. That's something that I remember worrying about when I first started the job, kind of wondering what that adjustment was going to be like. And then, it's pretty seamless as long as you go in there and are professional and like I said, not a jerk. It works itself out.
Yeah. Well, and you recently met with Zach Lavine, which that was in person, right? I know it was over the podcast, so we couldn't see you guys, but yeah, I assume based on the way that you guys were talking, it was getting back to normal, so it seemed like it was in person. But you recently met with him in Vegas, where Team USA, they were playing and training and for their exhibition games leading up to the Olympics, which was a great intervio, by the way. I actually made a video on that discussion. I always like it when you guys are able to do those one-on-one interviews. The post and pre-game pressers are obviously always great, but just having that one-on-one, I think is incredible. And one of the topics that stuck out to me was around Zach Lavine's contract extension, and his long-term future with the Bulls. Now, you asked about it, and of course, Zach isn't going to share a ton of information as it relates to his contract extension talks, because that's between him, his agent, the front office. But what I thought was reassuring was the fact that he said he wants to be a Chicago Bull. And I know players say that, and then they sometimes end up leaving. But the way in which he talked about it with you just seemed very genuine, in that he really does want to stick with this team. He wants to build this team into contender and bring them back to relevancy. And what were your thoughts on the way that he approached that topic? Because we couldn't see him, as a podcast, but what was his demeanor like, his body language when you were talking to him about his impending free agency?
Yeah. So one thing with Zach that I, haven't known him for or covered him for 2 seasons, 2 years, just about, he's very good with the media. He's the guy. I mean, he's the guy that is answering for sins that, maybe his, maybe not his, for this team, basically since he got here, for a bad rebuilding team that for the last 2 years has underperformed expectations. So he's definitely used to answering questions and doing it in an honest way. I think the more fans see that, the more they'll come to kind of appreciate the player and the person that Zach is. As it relates to the contract extension thing, doing it in person obviously helps with every aspect of an interview, and that doing that and having that be the first time I had really been in a room with a Bulls player to do an on-the-record interview since last March. It made me realize how much you miss it, and I hope that showed through. just kind of what hopefully we will be getting back next year, because at the end of the day, our job is to serve the fans too. So if it's more honest, if it's more genuine, if it's more substantive content, like that's in everybody's best interest. As it relates to the contract question and his answer, yeah, I think he gave the answer that you would expect. I think he was probably went a little further down the road of saying that he loved being a Bull and wanted to be there long term, and that was really what mattered to him. He definitely was stronger on that than I might have expected. So I suppose if you're a fan that wants to see him around long term, and I know a lot of fans that I know do, that's encouraging. And a couple other things that impressed me about his answer. One, being cognizant of the considerations that would have to come into play for him to be renegotiated and extended this offseason. That's obviously one route the Bulls can go. They can clear, about $14 million in cap space and elevate him to his max over the next couple seasons. That's certainly an option that I think is worth exploring and discussing, and, investing in your best player and locking him in long term if you believe in him enough to build around him. There's value to that. But for a guy like Zach, who hasn't won at a high level in the NBA in his career, I think he also would see the value in investing those resources in making the team better and trying to bring in, a capable starting point guard, an upgrade for Coby White. In terms of a heavy minutes load starting point guard type of context, I think he'd see the value in that. I think he'd see the value in bringing back some of the key veterans, guys like Thad Youngs, the Tomas Satoranskis. We don't know exactly which way the Bulls are going to go. We're going to find out in, about a week or two when free agency opens. But when he mentioned something in his answer about, not wanting to totally hamstring the team in free agency because he knows the considerations that go into a long-term extension for him, I was impressed that he kind of was cognizant of all that. And it makes me think that him and the Bulls seem to be on the same page at this point. I don't know whether the extension will get done this offseason or next offseason, or like you said, ask Celtics fans with Kyrie Irving, like how it works out when a player commits to a year in advance.
Right.
All this is talk until the ink dries. So we don't know how it's going to play out, but for now, it seems like they're on the same page and that there's a healthy line of communication. You hear Zach talk about Billy Donovan or AK or anybody, and that seems to at least be there, even if the on-court results aren't yet. So I think all of those were positive signs. And then the other thing I would say about Zach and the mode in which he got to Chicago, which was being traded on his rookie contract and being traded into a situation where he was the front guy. I think he's always really bought into, what comes with that, the responsibility of improving your own game every year. Now he's starting to appreciate the little things that go into winning and the little things that go into being a leader. So I think all of that plays into his contentment with the situation in Chicago currently, even if it doesn't on the court appear to be necessarily a positive situation. I think there is a considerable amount of buy-in for him, at least for next year. And again, if he's not extended going into next season, anything could happen. He's an unrestricted free agent. And, Lord knows, peruse around Twitter, like there'll be teams interested if he is an unrestricted free agent. So you never know. But, I thought it was an answer that was well crafted on his end. Seemed like he was prepared for the question, obviously. And it's one that for now should have fans encouraged, just that he knows his worth and he's going to get what he deserves or what he feels that he's owed, and that's his right. But at the same time, he is aware of kind of all the considerations at play and was conscious enough at least to undercut everything that he said with, this doesn't mean that I'm not committed to the Bulls long-term if it takes until next offseason, or if things take a little bit of a circuitous route to get there. At least for now, he seems to be pretty happy with the direction of the franchise and the way that they've invested in him. So I would be encouraged by all of that. Those are my big takeaways from
yeah. And, I was going to kind of talk about that specifically because I did find that interesting. Like you said, he's cognizant of the salary cap constraints and what can be done for an extension this offseason versus next offseason. A lot of Bulls fans, from what I hear, and a lot of my viewers, based on comments that they leave, they, when Zach says something like that, it means, Zach is going to be willing to take a discount, to ensure that the Bulls can bring in quality talent. Now, I personally, don't really believe in that. I think there's really going to be no way that Zach is going to be willing to take less than a max or take a discount, if you will, because he said multiple times he wants what he deserves. He wants to be taken care of. He mentioned that in the podcast interview you had. He also mentioned that in his exit interview with the team. And quite frankly, you could say he's already been taking a discount last couple of seasons based on his play and his level of production. So I guess in your opinion, do you think there's any way that Zach would be willing to take less than the max?
No, I don't think so, at least as it stands right now. And to your point about the contract that he's been on for the last couple of years, not only has it turned into a massive underpay, which is a pretty amazing development actually from where it started 3-4 years ago when he signed it, and the Bulls matched. He signed the offer sheet with the Kings. The Bulls matched it it was talked about at the time as a pretty risky move by the Bulls, one that you probably had to make because he's the centerpiece of the Jimmy Butler trade. Of course. He's coming off a torn ACL, and you have to believe if you trade for him, a year prior and know that he's going to be rehabbing that injury, you don't just lose that belief in a player because of his performance in an abridged season or anything like that. But there was talk of that being an overpay. I think the last 2 years definitively, and you could probably make an argument for the year before that too, but really the last 2 years, it's turned into one of the better value contracts in the league. And Zach, in that interview, he had statistics off the top of his head that he's the only guy, in the top 20 scorers of the last 4 seasons, not under
paid under 20 million, right?
Under 20 million, exactly. So these are things that he is clearly aware of. I made a point to ask him about signing that offer sheet and how it's affected his mentality now. And it's clear that he used the fact that he had to go out and get an offer sheet and the fact that it was so below his market value, or at least it ended up being below his market value. It's clear that he used that as motivation to prove doubters, naysayers, whoever wrong, or just prove his worth to himself. So I expect him to be flexible with the team in terms of timing and kind of the ordering of this stuff to try to maximize the roster talent around him. Because I still think the most important thing to this guy is winning, and that he's at least tried and said all the right things and done all the right things the last 2 years to prove that. So I expect him to be flexible on the particulars, the dates, the ordering of things in that effort. But in terms of taking less, I wouldn't expect, knowing that his value around the league is pretty definitively the max. You just know that there would be multiple teams lining up with max offers for him if he was an unrestricted free agent right now. I would not anticipate him taking less than that when all is said and done. And I would push back on the notion that means that he's any less committed to winning, because in any walk of life, you got to know your worth. You have to get your worth while you still can. He's an all-star entering the prime of his career. And I think that's always right.
And you see other players, getting paid a lot more than him, who probably aren't as good as he is. You see that, and you want to get paid that kind of money. And you're right. It doesn't take away anything from the fact that he still wants to win or that he is less committed to the Bulls. It's just that he wants what he's worth. So I totally get that. Now, I don't want to just talk about Zach, but I do have one more question around that, you just based on what you had shared earlier today. Lavine's in Tokyo. Looks like he'll be able to play in the opener on Sunday. And, then just a few hours later, which, by the way, for those watching, we're recording this on Friday afternoon, but just a few hours ago, you also shared that, and you wrote an article on it actually about Kevin Durant's comments that he was live streaming on Instagram about, Zach is finally going to play defense. And he was saying this to Billy Donovan, which obviously is, all interesting, good fun. But what do you think that this experience for Zach going to play in the Olympics will have on him as a player in terms of his development and taking that experience and those learnings into the next season in playing with some of the best players in the world?
Yeah, I just think there's no way when you look at the experience on paper and you look at the track record of other star players that have gone to the Olympics then made big leaps after. Barring, obviously, an injury or a COVID scare or anything like that, which he was in protocol, it appears that was just a contact tracing, kind of a low-level situation. So barring any unfortunate circumstances like that, I just don't think there's anything that could be not a positive taken away from his perspective. I think being around guys on that roster that have won at the highest level, NBA champions in Draymond Green, Kevin Durant, NBA champions on the coaching staff, obviously Steve Kerr, Greg Popovich. I think he'll take a ton away in terms of attention to detail, leadership, just winning habits, things like the buzzwords like that, but that really do have meaning when you are trying to take that next step in your career at the stage that Zach is. That's all a good thing. I think his role acceptance and his I think now that Bradley Beal has unfortunately been ruled out after entering COVID protocol, I do think there's a chance that Zach has a pretty significant role with this team. But when it appeared he wasn't going to, he was perfectly happy to embrace a role of just being kind of an active defender, picking up opposing point guards, full court, things like that. So I think in the technical sense of basketball, like Kevin Durant's joking about it, but I do think being in that environment where it is so high pressure and there is so much internal accountability from the other winning players on the roster, I think that's only going to make him better as a defender, probably as a playmaker, because this team needs playmaking sorely. Obviously, there's a lot of good individual talent, scoring talent, but there's going to need to be someone who sets the table too, and maybe Zach can lean into that a bit. And then I think, just a great life experience. I don't think this Olympics is going to be anything compared to previous ones. Obviously, they'll be pretty tightly restricted. Tokyo is in a state of emergency COVID-wise right now, so hope everybody stays safe. But certainly there are just there are massive implications in terms of personal growth and maturity, growth in his game, technically in a basketball sense, and just being around that atmosphere of all those winning players and coaches. not only do you pick up those winning habits, you also build relationships. And we know that the NBA is a players league. It's a relationship league. It's a recruiting league. And, I wouldn't expect Zach to get too explicit on conversations that he's having with other guys there. But provided he doesn't get wooed or swayed to go somewhere else, I think that could eventually benefit the Bulls too. So I just, there's almost too many to count. I'm probably missing some. It's also significant that the Bulls have a player represented on that biggest stage. That's somewhere the franchise hasn't necessarily been the last few years. So I just think overall it's a completely awesome opportunity. It'll be fun to watch him, and definitely worth carving out 3 to 4 weeks of your off season to do. I'm sure Zach agrees with that, because all he's talked about is how eager he is to learn and how honored he is.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit for a second and talk about this past season.
Sure.
Obviously a disappointing season for the Bulls, to say the least. I think most of us fans assumed that we're going to be making the playoffs. I think even before the trade deadline, all the moves that were made at the deadline. But then especially after that, we thought that we're going to be playoff bound. So because you're an analytical guy, based on what you know of this team and how they performed this past season, what was really, in your view, single biggest issue that held this team back from their true potential? And what are some data points, if any, that we could use it to back up?
Yeah, I don't. So these numbers, they've now escaped my brain a little bit because it's been a couple months since the season. But I would point to, in terms of the on-court product, just general lack of attention to detail offensively, which I think would show up in their turnover rate, which ranked near the bottom of the league. Their clutch performance in games that were within 5 points with 5 minutes or less remaining. I mean, think of just anecdotally the amount of games that they seem to be out in front entering the final minutes. And then, some comedy of errors ensues, and they end up dropping games to not only teams better than them, but also teams that were probably a little bit lower than them on paper. The OKC loss from early in the season when they blew a 26-point second half lead comes to mind, among others. That's not great. A really woefully unimpressive record against winning teams is not great. So those things all jump out. Certainly, you have to acknowledge the Zach missing 11 games after testing positive for COVID late in the season. I don't necessarily think that is the single thing that derailed them, because if you remember, the last game before he was out was a game that they trailed by 15 to 20 points to the Orlando Magic at home. Wendell Carter Jr. looked like a former lottery pick, and he hadn't looked like that at all times throughout the early part of the season for the Bulls. So it's not as if they were on the right track when Zach went down. Now, did him going down remove pretty much any possibility of them finding their footing? Probably. So those things all jump out. The addition of Nikola Vucevic, while on paper, I think most would have guessed that would have led to a bump in the win-loss column. Didn't have that effect, and I think you could boil that down to, a lack of practice time, a lack of, or at least a misguided amount or a misguided direction of adjustments made by Billy Donovan. He took accountability for that at the end of the season. There was just a lot of juggling with what was an imbalanced roster. Too many bigs, not enough playmaking in the backcourt, certainly not enough two-way wings. That just kind of stilted them in an unproductive way. So I mean, you could spread all fields. You could go a ton of different directions with that. What was surprising to me, actually, the offense got worse after the Vucevic acquisition, and obviously Zach missing time hurts there. But I think you could also say that, and Billy, again, he mentioned this in his exit interview, did they lean a little bit too much into running a slowed down post-up heavy offense, when what was making their offense so efficient and aesthetically pleasing and productive at the beginning of the season was playing up tempo a little bit more? So these are all things that I expect them to be introspective on in the offseason, think about how they can tweak or rework things going into next season. The roster talent was certainly there for them to be at least a top 10 team in the East and make the play-in tournament. Next year, the expectation, I think, should be at least that, if not top 6, and be out of the play-in mix because of all the resources they've invested. But there are certainly a lot of holes to plug from a performance perspective, and then also just from a talent on the roster perspective.
Yeah. So kind of leading into that, I mean, we've got the draft coming up next week, and then free agency will begin, shortly thereafter. What moves do you expect to be made, in these coming weeks? And we're going to, like you said, we're going to find out shortly. Do you think we'll see some pretty big changes, kind of like what we saw at the trade deadline, or maybe more so of, last off season when Arturas first took over the role? Garrett Temple was sort of the only free agent that we were able to bring in. What are your expectations in these coming weeks?
If I had to pick an end of the spectrum to kind of align myself closer toward, it would probably be more towards the aggressive side, just because that last offseason, and there was criticism of him, of AK and Mark Eversley and the new front office staff that came in being, a little bit withdrawn last offseason. Yeah. I think the reason they did that was because they wanted to take this year, or as it turned out, 60% of this year for evaluation, and to see who on the roster were keepers and who, might be best served being flipped or let go in free agency, things like that. I think after a year, given all the ups and downs that they had, you have to have a pretty good idea of who from last year's roster you want back and what areas you need to improve. I expect them. So one, I would say I do expect them to be aggressive. Now, what that yields, I'm not sure. I would bet a large sum of money that they address the point guard position this offseason. I don't know. It's going to be difficult for them to get into the price bracket of some of these top tier names, the Kyle Lowrys, the Mike Conleys, if Chris Paul were to opt out. I think the window might be beyond them in terms of getting in the market for those guys. But, your Spencer Dinwiddies, your Lonzo Balls certainly is a big name around the Bulls fan base. Dennis Schroeder's, those type of names. I would expect them to be in the market for those guys because of how glaring a need that the point guard position is. There was buzz last offseason. They were going to address it. Certainly that's louder this offseason. So that would be one thing I would expect. They obviously have a second round pick that AK has never been shy about advertising that he views those as legitimate resources. He's not going to throw away that pick by any means. Marko Simonovic, their 2020 second round pick, all signs are pointing to him being over, picking 38th in this draft. That'll be an addition they can make. And then based on where that point guard hunt leads them, because I think that'll be the main domino to fall as to whether, how much cap flexibility they're going to have to work with. I think whether it be the room exception or the mid-level exception, room being around $5 to $6 million, mid-level being 9 to 10. Right. I would expect them to try to add some help in the wing department, the small forward department, because that was a position that they were just very, very thin at last year. You saw that by Lauri Markkanen playing, functioning as the backup small forward essentially for the down the stretch of the season, which certainly had its ups and downs and more downs than ups. But so I would definitely expect the big play to be the point guard, and then, see what they can procure in the second round, and then try to fill out the roster in the wing department as you get later down the line. That's at least what I would do. That's kind of the framework that I expect them to follow. And I definitely expect this roster to look a lot different coming into next season, especially when you talk about some of the dudes that might be that were here last year, your Lauri Markkanens, et cetera.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the roster is going to look pretty drastically different, right? Because you're talking about a lot of free agents, guys that might potentially not be re-signed. I wanted to talk about Coby White. I wasn't initially going to ask this question, but it's a recurring theme. Mm-hmm. The Bulls need to address their point guard position. They need to upgrade their point guard position. That's always what people are talking about. Do you think that Coby White could ever potentially be that point guard for the future? The reason I asked this is because I asked this to my last guest, and well, I'll share what they said, but want to get your thoughts as far as why are we just ruling out Coby White? He's only in his second. He's going to be in his third season. He's 21 years old, and towards the end of the season, he actually looked decent as far as really getting more of a feel for the game, slowing the game down more, and making smarter decisions. What are your thoughts? I mean, what role do you think that he could play for this Bulls team?
Yeah, I agree with you that I think his decision-making really improved down the stretch of last season. And I, like Coby, he talked about this, saw that as a little bit more sustainable than just kind of the heater that he went on at the end of his rookie season. I think right. There was a little bit more sustainable ground broken to build on. I don't want to put a cap on a guy who's 21 that was a 7th overall pick. And I know it hasn't always been pretty with Coby, but from a mentality perspective, from a consistent improvement perspective, he did get better this year compared to last year. I don't want to count that guy out in terms of looking down the line to the future, being an answer at the point guard position for the Bulls or anybody else. So I would not put a ceiling on him at this point as it relates to that. Following the tea leaves, though, of how much buzz there is around them addressing the point guard position and the need to really elevate next year in terms of making the playoffs, I'm not sure that he can be, a high-level starting point guard on a playoff team next year that's going to give the Bulls what they need from that position, which is getting others involved, organizing offense, being a consistent third scorer alongside Zach Lavine and Nikola Vucevic. He certainly flashed the ability to be that, but it just wasn't that on a consistent basis in his second year. What 20-year-old is going to be? So these are high expectations, but the organization has kind of put that expectations on themselves to a degree by accelerating the timeline to needing to win now. And then, of course, all that's without mentioning that Coby just underwent shoulder surgery a few weeks ago, and we don't even know if he's going to be ready for the start of the season. And that's unfortunate. I'm sure there's no one sicker about that than him. And it'll cost him some valuable development time this offseason. So in terms of what role I could see him playing next season, obviously I can't guarantee anything in terms of how they'll address the point guard position. So it's a little bit open-ended there. I see him as being a guy who plays starter minutes, 25 to 30 minutes a game, and is certainly incredibly useful as a playmaker. I think again, it wasn't always pretty last year, but getting those reps that he got certainly could have only helped him as a decision maker when he's put in those situations next year. So occasional playmaker, obviously slasher, spot up shooter. I think those are the roles that in terms of immediate contributions next year, he's going to provide the most surefire kind of safe bet to produce. So I would see him playing those starter level minutes, closing when appropriate, fitting into 3-guard lineups because he does have pretty good positional size for a combo guard. I definitely see him being a integral piece of this team, especially offensively. But if the Bulls want to win next year and really elevate into the top 6 of the Eastern Conference, I think you just need to see a more established veteran kind of cerebral name there. And your best case scenario is probably getting a guy for a couple years and having Coby learn under them, right? And then, you loop back and see where he's at in a couple years or maybe at the end of this year. I think that's probably your best case scenario in terms of helping him.
Well, and I've actually talked about that a lot on my channel recently, how I was saying, I think someone like a Kyle Lauri would be potentially a good option because he's more of a short-term solution because, again, he's 35 years old and he's going to be almost 36, and he's still going to command a lot of money. So I think that's something to be mindful of. But for Kyle Lauri, you bring in someone like him who has a lot of experience, a great playmaker, a good defender. He's an NBA champion. You could really have him be a mentor for Coby.
Sure.
And then by the time that Kyle Lauri, retires, hopefully Coby is then ready and for that type of role and to be that starting point guard. I know it's more wishful thinking than anything, but that's sort of my viewpoint on that. That could be a potential option. I did want to ask you just real quick about his injury, though. Do you think that what are the chances that he will be ready to go at the start of the season? Because I know that the initial timeline was 4 months, but it sounded like that was when he'll be evaluated. Doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be ready to go in 4 months. Do you think that this, his injury is probably going to cut into the season a little bit, and we might not be able to have him go when the season starts in October?
Yeah. So that reevaluation timeline, as you said, 4 months, falls right in the middle of training camp, early to mid-October. So to be evaluated then, to me, and then the season starts pretty soon after that, I would be prepared for the possibility that he's not going to start the season. Can't say definitively either way until we know kind of the status of his rehab. We obviously haven't heard from Coby on the record in a little while. So I would be prepared for that possibility going off of Paul George had a very similar injury a couple years ago. Actually, the year that he was traded to the Clippers, and he missed a couple weeks at the beginning of the season. I believe it was 10 or 15 games. I don't have it exactly in front of me, but if Coby follows that trajectory, and that's kind of what I've been working off of, that was about a 5 month to a full recovery, smack dab in the middle of what is usually for an injury like that 4 to 6. That's what most people guess. I would be prepared for the possibility that he's not ready for the start of the season, but he's a young guy, he's 21 and is pretty resilient mentally and physically. He's a guy that's never really been injured before in his NBA career. So when he does get back, I would expect him to hit the ground running. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if, you see him miss the first 10 or so games of the year, maybe a couple weeks to a month into the season, and then he slides back in when he slides back in.
Got it. I do want to be mindful of time, but I also want to talk real quickly about Marko Simonovic. You were talking about him just a little bit ago. I mean, so it sounds like he will be joining the Bulls after being, a draft and stash player for one season. I hear a lot of Bulls fans, including a lot of my viewers, think that this guy is going to be the Lauri Markkanen replacement, or he's potentially going to be the next Nikola Jokic, or even better than Markkanen. And I'm just like, this, in my view, is very, very premature. You're talking about Markkanen, who, yes, has struggled the past couple of seasons, but still a lottery pick. He's a great shooter. He's very productive in his first 2 seasons in the league. You're talking about Simonovic, a guy who is a second-round pick, hasn't played a single game in the NBA. And that's not a knock on him. It's just that Lauri Markkanen is an NBA player. So do you think that as Bulls fans, we need to kind of take a step back, manage expectations with Simonovic? And I guess really a 2-part question. with the front office bringing him in, what does that signal really for the future of Markkanen or even potentially Thaddeus Young and Tice? Because you're not going to have all these big men on the Bulls roster that they have right now. Now also adding Simonovic.
Absolutely. First expectations for Marco, definitely we can temper them for a 44th overall pick. I think if he's a productive or positive player at all in any role, just being in the rotation, even on the fringe rotation, I think if he's a positive impact guy at all, that'll be exceeding expectations.
That's a good thing, right? Yeah.
For a 44th overall pick. Exactly. I've watched a little bit of his tape. He certainly looks the part of a guy that can replace some of Lauri Markkanen's production because he's got pretty good size. He can play the 4 or 5, stretch the floor. The shooting appears to be the most directly applicable NBA skill. So we'll see. I mean, my eyes will be peeled summer league if he is indeed around for that. Him and Patrick Williams in the 2nd round pick this year. Those are the guys that I'll be really zeroed in on, especially Marco, because that won't be full NBA competition. That won't be exactly what he's facing when he gets to the Bulls full time. But it'll be a taste. It'll be kind of a little barometer of how he's going to adjust to that. So my eyes will be peeled on that. I think what you're hoping for him is he's a solid 3rd or 4th big, and you'd be happy with that. You would have to be happy with that. Certainly not the next Jokic. But the question about how his ripples could affect the rest of the front court rotation, I just think that's an area of the roster that the Bulls really need to clean up and reallocate resource wise to the perimeter, to wings, to obviously the point guard position, which we've talked about. So I didn't expect Lauri Markkanen to be back before the Simonovic news. Certainly that doesn't change it in the direction of I would think he'd be more likely to be back. I don't think you let a 2nd round pick that you don't know what to expect from. I don't think you can let him too drastically affect your plans because certainly as they were going through this season, the Bulls didn't know for sure that he would be over for the 2021-2022 year.
Right.
But so it's, Lauri, I don't expect him to be back next season necessarily. Simonovic news doesn't necessarily change that. In terms of Thad versus Tice, I've long been a proponent of, as much as I really love both of those guys and what they bring on the basketball floor on both ends, playmaking, just veteran smarts, toughness, everything that this team could use. I just think from a roster balance perspective, you probably need to consolidate at a certain point.
Yeah.
And parting with either one of those guys gives you a little bit more flexibility cap-wise to address other areas of the roster that you need to address. So I wouldn't say that Simonovic necessarily means that 1 or 2 or all of them are gone, but I think for other reasons, you probably are going to need to narrow those 3 kind of power forward type guys down to 1. And Simonovic certainly gives you a safety net. He's a project, he's a developmental piece, still young. So you hope that he could grow into something. And, there's little flashes of playmaking and some solid defensive moments in there too. If you go watch his tape from overseas. So I wouldn't put too much into him, but certainly it adds a little bit of fuel to the fire of the discussion of how are the Bulls going to consolidate their front court assets and balance the roster a little bit better. So I would definitely expect one of those 3 to be back. At least that's how I would handle it. And we'll see where it goes from here. But if they can get 10 to 15 minutes a game out of Simonovic next year in a positive way, I think that'll be more than enough.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of my expectation is, he'll get some minutes. I don't think that he's going to be in the rotation all that often, but if you get any sort of level of productivity out of him, out of a 2nd round pick, that's good. So I think a lot of Bulls fans, the ones that think that he's just going to be Lauri Markkanen 2.0 or even, the Nikola Jokic comparisons, like they're going to be sorely disappointed. But let's talk about this upcoming season just for a moment, because this season is going to be an important one for the Bulls and really determining the future of this team. Last year was an evaluation year, so this is the year this team really needs to show that they're making that leap. But I'm curious to know, in your view, which player do you think this season will it be the most important for? Obviously you have Zach Lavine, their best player, their all-star with his impending free agency. Then you have the younger guys and Patrick Williams, Coby White. You really need to show, that they're proving that they're making strides from the previous season. But if you had to choose a player, who would you say that this is going to be the most important season for them, for their overall career?
Patrick Williams, no question. Yeah. It's an easy answer for me. I think the Bulls, they don't have a lot of luxuries in the situation they're in right now, but the one luxury they have is their 2 best players. You know what you're getting from them on a nightly basis in Zach Lavine and Nikola Vucevic, and what you're getting are 2 incredibly productive offensive players. With Pat, it was up and down his rookie season, especially towards the end. It looked like he hit that rookie wall a little bit, and it was mostly down. as a number 4 overall pick, the first draft pick of this new regime, he really needs to blossom into that third option long-term alongside those guys, because we don't know how the point guard situation is going to get resolved. We don't know how the cap space calculation this offseason is going to get resolved. The one thing we know for sure is that Patrick Williams is going to be in the starting lineup next year, whether it be at the 3 or the 4. He's going to be tasked on most nights with guarding opponents' best players. And well, I think he showed flashes of that inspire optimism in that department last season. Offensive improvements are going to need to come, mostly in terms of volume and accepting more responsibility to be assertive offensively, to go get his own shot, even facilitate for others, just shoot more. I mean, that was a pretty. It sounds pretty basic and simplistic to say, but that really was such a point of emphasis from Billy Donovan and his teammates last year. I really think you can make a case that, outside of the all-star known commodities, he's the X factor and the Bulls' most important player coming into next season. If there is a big year 1 to year 2 jump for him, I think it could go a long way towards telling us the heights that this team to reach. So I think he's a pretty easy answer, just given the inconsistencies in year 1, which are understandable. It's a 19-year-old starting 70 some odd games, after a pretty untraditional drafting process to being thrown right into training camp, to being thrown right into the season. A lot of that can be forgiven, but coming into next year, now that he's had this full offseason, and there's been a lot of positive talk about his what he's been able to do this offseason. Obviously, he was with the select team out in Vegas with Zach. These are all great experiences, but the Bulls really badly need. It's a lot to put on a 20-year-old. He'll be 20 by the time next season starts. But again, this is the position that the Bulls are in, and I think he's pretty clearly, not only is it he the player that it's most important for their own development, but also for the team's immediate success. He's by far my easiest pick for the X Factor going into next year.
Yeah. And did you get a chance to chat with him at all, or watch him out in Vegas when he was with the select team?
No. So unfortunately, I was able to sit in person with Zach, obviously distance, masked, all the protocols being followed and everything like that. But so things are getting back to normal slightly. Unfortunately, media were not allowed in the practices, so wasn't able to see Pat in action. Wasn't able to talk much with him. We kind of have to take Zach's word for it, and he says he looked awesome. So I'm sure there are hidden files in the USA Basketball, video people's vaults that will tell the true story. But no, unfortunately, wasn't able to get much of a look at that.
Okay. I want to wrap it up with one last question, just because I'm sure my viewers are always curious about this. I myself am as well. But when we're talking about trade rumors, obviously there are a lot of trade rumors that go around throughout the league every season. I think most of them, end up not really coming to fruition. They end up just being rumors. And, I want to know, is there anything that you're hearing on your end as far as any potential trade options that this front office might be considering?
No, I can honestly say no. I mean, not only is it kind of an odd time in terms of all the COVID stuff, everyone is still kind of scattered. This is a front office that since the beginning has moved pretty much in silence when they were being more
keep things under wraps for sure.
And when they were moving, when they were more withdrawn and more of an evaluation mindset, they were quiet. When they were more aggressive, crafting the trade for Nikola Vucevic over a week or two long span, they were quiet. I mean, that caught me as much by surprise as any fan. So really, especially with so many different directions they could go this offseason, I can't say confidently that I know, I couldn't call a specific name to mind, trade or signing, that I would feel good about predicting or putting out there or anything like that. But, all signs point to, like we were talking about earlier, an aggressive mentality from the front office and a lot of changes on this roster, one way or the other. And given how last season went, that should excite people, given the expectations for next year.
Absolutely. Well, Rob, I really do appreciate the time, man. I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to chat with me about Bulls basketball. I always love talking about Bulls basketball. So hopefully we stay in touch. I would love to have connect sometime middle in the season. We can kind of talk through things again. But yeah, hope you enjoy the off season, and we'll see what kind of comes in these next couple weeks. We're going to find out a lot about this team and what they're going to be looking like here pretty soon.
It's going to be fun. We've been wandering the wilderness for a couple months here without much going on. The playoffs, obviously, everybody would love it if the Bulls could get back to that stage soon. But soon there will certainly be a lot of activity to dive into.